At my graduation, my dad mocked me as a failure. Everyone laughed, until I pulled out my new house keys. 10 minutes later, you ever feel like no matter what you do, you'll never be good enough for your own family? That's been my life since I can remember. My father, Greg, never acknowledged anything I accomplished. If I got good grades, he'd say they weren't great. If I won an award, he'd joke that it must have been a slow year for talent. My siblings, Jake and Lisa, picked up on his attitude early. Mocking me became their favorite pastime. And my mother, Sarah, just stood there watching, never stepping in, never defending me. It started small, like teasing me about my interests. If I read a book, Jake would call me a nerd. If I talked about a future career, Lisa would scoff, saying, "Yeah, sure, keep dreaming." But over the years, the jokes got sharper, more personal. The older I got, the clearer it became. No matter what I did, they had already decided I was a joke. And the worst part? They enjoyed tearing me down. Every time I achieved something, they twisted it into an insult. When I got into a great college on a scholarship, you'd think they'd be proud. Instead, Greg said, "Guess they were handing those out like candy this year." Jake joked that I must have begged the admissions office. Lisa smirked and said, "Hope you don't embarrass yourself." I remember sitting at the dinner table that night, holding back my frustration. They never had expectations for me, but somehow, they still found a way to diminish every step forward I took. I tried to ignore it, to focus on myself, but it was impossible to completely block out the constant negativity. Even when I wasn't home, their voices lived rent-free in my head. Every failure felt like proof they were right about me. But then, something shifted. The more they doubted me, the more I wanted to prove them wrong. Their mockery became fuel. If they thought I couldn't succeed, I'd make them eat their words. So I worked, harder than ever. Late nights, early mornings, grinding through every challenge. And as I pushed myself, I realized something: they needed me to fail. Because if I succeeded, then they'd have to face the uncomfortable truth that they had wasted years tearing down someone who had always been worth something. And that scared them more than anything. But their fear wouldn't stop me. I had my sights set on something bigger, something they could never take away from me. And I'd make sure they saw it when the time was right. Graduation day was supposed to be a celebration, a moment where years of hard work finally paid off. I stood there in my cap and gown, diploma in hand, scanning the crowd for my family. Part of me hoped, stupidly, that this would be different. That maybe, just maybe, Greg would finally say he was proud. That Jake and Lisa would at least pretend to be happy for me. But as soon as I spotted them, I knew better. The smirks, the exchanged glances, it was just another joke to them. The ceremony was nearly over when it happened. My name had just been called, and as I walked across the stage, I heard it. Laughter. Not the kind of proud chuckle a parent lets out when their kid does something amazing. No, this was mockery. My father's voice rang out, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Well, would you look at that? Guess they'll give a degree to anyone these days." His words cut through the crowd like a knife. Jake and Lisa cackled. My mother, silent as ever. A few people turned, their faces shifting from confusion to discomfort. My stomach twisted, but I kept walking, gripping my diploma tighter. I wanted to believe that no one noticed, that the moment would pass. But no, Greg wasn't done. "Hope you got a refund policy on that degree, kid," he shouted, making sure the humiliation landed right where he wanted it, square in the center of my chest. The worst part? No one said anything. No professor, no classmate, no stranger in the audience told him to stop. I was alone, standing in front of hundreds of people, pretending like it didn't bother me. Pretending like I hadn't spent my entire life waiting for just one moment where he'd look at me with something other than disappointment. But instead, all I got was another reminder that, to them, my success was nothing more than a punchline. I didn't break. I refused to. I stood tall, smiling for the cameras like nothing had happened. If there was one thing I had learned growing up in that house, it was how to swallow my pride without letting them see the cracks. But inside, something shifted. I wasn't going to let them define me anymore. If they thought this was the final chapter of my story, they had no idea what was coming next. Because what they didn't know, what none of them saw, was that I had been preparing for this moment for years. And soon enough, they'd realize they had spent their whole lives laughing at the wrong person. I didn't say a word after the ceremony. I didn't argue, didn't fight back, didn't even let them see that they had gotten under my skin. Instead, I let them bask in their little moment of victory. Let them think they had won. We went out to dinner afterward, a tradition they insisted on, probably just to keep the act going. The whole time, Greg cracked jokes at my expense, Jake and Lisa threw in their usual jabs, and my mother sat there, quiet as ever. But I wasn't angry, not anymore, because I knew something they didn't. The moment came just as the check arrived. Greg leaned back, smug as ever, and said, "Well, at least now you can finally start paying us back for all those years we wasted on you." That was it. That was my cue. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small set of keys, and placed them on the table. The sound was small, barely noticeable, but it landed, like a gunshot in a silent room. Instantly, the energy shifted. Jake squinted at the keys, trying to piece together what they meant. Lisa let out a short laugh, like she thought it was some kind of joke. "What's that for?" she asked, still smirking. I leaned back, mirroring my father's posture. "My house," I said simply. 3 words, nothing more. Just enough to watch their expressions shift from amusement to something else entirely. Greg's smile faded first, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to figure out if I was lying. "What do you mean, your house?" he asked. "I mean, I bought a house," I replied, keeping my tone light, casual. Like it was no big deal, but it was a big deal and they knew it. For the first time, their usual comebacks didn't come. Lisa opened her mouth, then closed it. Jake scoffed, but it wasn't as confident as before. "You're lying," Jake finally said, but his voice lacked the usual bite. "You couldn't afford that." I shrugged, pulling my phone out and scrolling through my gallery until I found the pictures. Keys in my hand, standing in front of my house, a place they had no part in. I turned the screen toward them, watching as the reality set in. No loans from them, no handouts, no help. Just me. Their silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I realized something. They weren't laughing anymore. The silence stretched across the table like a thick fog. No more laughter, no more smug remarks. Just the weight of what I had just done settling in. Greg, who always had something to say, just stared at the keys like they didn't make sense. Jake tapped his fingers against the table, his usual confidence cracking. Lisa, for once in her life, looked like she had nothing clever to add. And my mother, for the first time, she actually looked proud, or maybe just shocked. Either way, she was the only one who didn't look like she had swallowed a lemon. Then Greg let out a forced chuckle. "Well, look at you," he muttered, but there was no humor in it. He tried to play it off like it didn't bother him, but I could see it. The shift. The moment he realized I wasn't the one struggling anymore. That title now belonged to them. I had spent years being their punching bag, the one they dismissed, the one they looked down on. And yet, here I was, the only one at this table who had actually built something. Jake tried to recover next. "Must be a tiny place," he scoffed, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. Lisa mumbled something about how I was probably drowning in debt, trying desperately to poke holes in something they couldn't tear down. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The fact that they were scrambling to find an insult said everything. I just leaned back, sipping my drink, letting them sit with their own discomfort. And that's when it really hit them. For years, they had controlled the narrative. They were the ones who decided who was successful, who was worthy of respect. But now, they couldn't deny it anymore. They had spent so much time laughing at me, convinced I'd never be anything, that they never saw this coming. It wasn't just about the house, it was about what it represented. I had won, and not by tearing them down the way they did to me, but by rising above them. My mother finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "I'm happy for you," she said, and for once I actually believed her. Maybe she had always wanted to say something but never found the courage. Maybe seeing me succeed made her realize how wrong they had been. Or maybe she just saw what I had already figured out. This wasn't just a power shift. It was a reckoning. Because the truth was, I didn't need them anymore. And that terrified them more than anything. The ride home was different. No mocking, no snide comments. Just an uncomfortable quiet hanging in the air. I could feel Greg's frustration, Jake's bitterness, Lisa's disbelief. They weren't used to this dynamic, to me being the one they couldn't look down on. And for the first time, I realized I didn't care what they thought. Their approval, their validation, it never mattered. Because I had built something without them. And that made them irrelevant. When we got back, I didn't stay long. I had my own place now, my home. No more sleeping under the roof of people who enjoyed tearing me down. No more sitting at a dinner table where I was the punchline. I grabbed my things, walked to the door, and just before I left, I turned back. They were all still standing there, watching me like they didn't know what to say, so I made it easy for them. "Take care," I said, And then I walked out. The drive to my house felt different than any drive I'd ever taken. Lighter, like I had finally cut the last thread that tied me to the version of myself they had tried to create. When I pulled into the driveway, I just sat there for a moment, staring at the place I had worked so hard for. It wasn't just a house, it was proof. Proof that I had never needed them. Proof that I had won without playing their game. Proof that I had taken every insult, every joke, every moment of belittlement and turned it into something real. As I stepped inside, I didn't feel anger or resentment. I didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. The battle was already won. And the best part? I had done it without sinking to their level. No yelling, no dramatic speeches, just quiet, undeniable success. The kind that speaks louder than any insult ever could. I sat down on my couch, looking around at the space that was mine and mine alone. No Greg, no Jake, no Lisa, just peace. And for the first time in my life, I finally felt free. Because at the end of the day, the best revenge isn't anger, it's success. And they'd have to live with that for the rest of their lives.